Thank you. How many Rebeccas in the house? Middle name? All right. How many people are either named Rebecca or named a child Rebecca? Wow, more than I thought. There's a whole bunch. That's great. I'm at least going to have some friends at the end of the night. Get logged in here. From the beginning. All right, it's up there. Planted in the land, understandable envy. Going back to go forward. I liked what Adam said the first night. I'm going to go way back to go forward. So, planted in the land. Israel has the land back in part today. The land promised to Abraham is much bigger than the land Israel has today, even if we ignore Gaza and the West Bank. And there are still more Jews outside the land than inside the land. Tonight we're going to take a whirlwind tour of the history of Israel, from its beginnings to where it is today. We could actually go back to Genesis 1, and even on the subject of envy, we could go back to Cain and Abel. But we're not going to do that. We'll start with Abraham, but that still gives us a long time to go. That promise was passed on to Isaac, then to Jacob, who was renamed Israel, and from Israel branches out from there. We also know that Abraham got none of this land during his lifetime, except he got a grave, which he purchased. And in it, he buried Sarah. He's buried there. Isaac, Rebekah, and Leah were also buried there. They were planted in the land. But despite not getting the land, they were actually very successful. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph were very, very rich, despite often being persecuted and hated even amongst themselves. Now, this has been a common pattern throughout the history of the Jews to this day. Early on, Abraham was warned. And I'm going to say Abraham even if it was back when he was Abram, so forgive me for that. He was told, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years, but I will bring judgment on that nation." Abraham has no offspring at all when this is told to him. Soon after, he's going to have Ishmael. But God has other plans, which he reveals to him about 13 years later when his son Isaac is born. His only begotten son Isaac, he's called in the book of Hebrews. Now, what's the nation that would persecute Abraham's seed? Egypt. Now, who was the first of Abraham's offspring to be persecuted by an Egyptian? Anyone? Isaac. He, Ishmael, who was born according to the flesh, persecuted him, Isaac, who was born according to the Spirit. Paul tells us in Galatians. Ishmael, the son of Hagar, the Egyptian woman, Sarah had her husband had a child with. And if you do the math, you can find out that this is the beginning of the 400 years of Egyptian persecution, but that's a subject for another day. Ishmael persecuted Isaac because of what I'm calling here understandable envy. Ishmael was born first, and his father himself believed he would be the heir. But all that was taken when the little brat was born. So it's very understandable that he would feel bad about that. But what did Sarah say? Cast out the bondwoman and her son. So Ishmael and his mother were cast out at God's direction because Abraham didn't want to do it. But God said, no, do what Sarah said. Now, I look at this as kind of like, you ever see a football game where a guy goes to make a catch and it hits his shoulder pad and it bounces around and he jumps and runs and bats in the air and dives and makes a catch? That's kind of what Sarah does, because she's the one who created the problem in the first place. And in the end, she comes up with the solution of send Ishmael away. Now, we're going to see a pattern forming here, and Brother Doug's class this morning made me think of a quote I used the last time I spoke here, which was, stop thinking of the real world as a simple place of objects. It's not. It's a complex place of patterns. Even if you knew where every single particle in the entire universe was, and where it was going to be at any moment, you would still know almost nothing, because the reality is in the patterns, not in the little things that are here and there. Now, human nature is one of these patterns, and envy is a sub-pattern of the general pattern of human nature. And we'll see that as we go. Next example is Isaac and Abimelech. Abimelech was another man of the land, and they were rivals with Isaac, although they were somewhat friendly between the two of them. This is the guy that he pulled the trick on from his father of, she's my sister. And Isaac learned that from his dad and pulled the same trick. But it ended up working out okay. But eventually, he became so rich, the Philistines envied him, and they started plugging up holes and plugging up his wells to try to combat that. And Abimelech eventually said to Isaac, "Go away from us. You're much mightier than we." So envy, along with fear, is the motivation to persecute Isaac, the son of Abraham. And yet God continues to make him prosper. This envy, again, is understandable. He seems unfairly blessed compared to them. We're also seeing the beginning of another pattern here, expelling the Jews from the land. And as a lead into our next example, I wanted to say I've been very pleased with how well my talk has not conflicted with Brother Keith, because I could see him coming up with a lot of the same examples I did, but I see our classes going like this. Except we do kind of butt heads on one thing, and I told him about this, and he said it was fine for me to bring this up, so here it goes. In my class here 5 years ago called Unity, Liberty, and Charity, I ended with an example of a lady who I believe gets a bit of a bum rap. The purpose was to help us be compassionate towards people who commit sins rather than being harshly judgmental, as is another pattern of human nature. Keith told the story of Job this morning. In my class that year, I told, from my imagination, a story that's at least consistent with the Bible that I called Remember Job's Wife. When it's hard to love your brothers and sisters, either because they make it hard or otherwise, consider that they may be suffering terrible things that you don't know about. In her case, a house fell on all 10 of her children and killed them. So it's understandable that she might snap and say something she would later regret. And yet the following things have been said of her. Augustine called her Satan's accomplice. John Calvin called her a diabolical fury. Matthew Henry called her a troubler and a tempter. And C.C. Walker, Christadelphian, called her, said of her, became the Satan. So, and I would add to that, one of the cruelest treatments of her is the mockery, where people say, yeah, Satan took everything away from her, but he let him keep his wife. Ha, ha, ha. Like that was a big joke, that she was the negative that you got to keep. But what did Job say about her? Or to her? He said, "You speak as one of the foolish women speak." He didn't say, "You are a foolish woman." Those aren't the same thing. That indicated to me that what she said was out of character in that situation. She had been a faithful partner to him for all those years. Now, I could be completely wrong about her. She could be every bit as horrible as people have often said, but there's no evidence that she was. And my advice there is to cut the lady some slack. The house just smashed all 10 of her kids into the ground. And it looked like she was about to lose her husband. Okay, so I've got another lady that I want to tell you about, Rebecca. Now, why did I give her such a giant print? After all, isn't she the woman who taught her favorite son to deceive his father to get the blessing instead of his father's favorite? But that's a grossly simplistic caricature of who she was. Rebecca's another woman who I believe gets a bit of a bum rap. I'm going to make the case here tonight, and you don't have to agree with me, just kind of go with me for now, that she is one of the greatest people in all of the Old Testament. But just hear me out if you don't agree with that. Let's look at her story. She went willingly with Abraham's servant to marry a man she had never met. She was given the choice. Will you go with this man? She said, I will go. She's related to Isaac on both sides of her family. Both her parents are descended from Abraham's father, Terah. Each one was a descendant from one of Abraham's brothers. So the family policy of marrying within the family goes all the way back before Abraham to Terah, at least. And she respected it and abided by it. She is also the first person of whom it was said went and inquired of the Lord when she was pregnant and having a difficult time. She was the one given the prophecy that the older would serve the younger. Rebekah got this prophecy, not Isaac. So Rebekah had a very good reason to favor Jacob. Isaac had a very bad reason to favor Esau, and that's what he hunts and brings me good food to eat. Fourth, Rebekah saw that Esau had married Hittites, and the effects of that were apparent to her as her grandchildren were growing. And it says that Esau's wives, Judith and Basemath, were a grief of mind to Isaac and Rebekah. So Isaac apparently had not done enough to stop his son from doing that. He didn't get a wife for Esau the way Abraham had gotten a wife for him. So next she overheard Isaac preparing to give the family blessing to Esau. This seems like her last chance. Up till now, perhaps she held out hope that Isaac would do the right thing and make Jacob his primary heir. But once the blessing was given, there was no taking it back. And Isaac was so overwhelmed by his love of his very manly son Esau. And let's be honest, if we had a very manly son who's out running touchdowns, we might favor him over a son who's doing more ordinary things. Because that's the way we dudes are. It's just part of our makeup, I guess. And he apparently wouldn't see reason on this. So Rebekah's in a moment of crisis. And to use the modern vernacular, I'm going to keep my G rating. Oh, heck no. We're not putting up with this. So Rebekah she takes quick action. Now I'm going to suggest that what she does is possibly an act of war against the Hittites. She might be thinking, we're not turning our family over to the Hittites. She's seeing that Esau has already gone that direction. And if the blessing goes there, there's not much left, even if Jacob makes the right choice. So, deceiving her husband, that's certainly something that is subject to criticism. But she's got a major crisis going on here. She took decisive action to save her family from the Hittites. She also risked a curse being upon her. Remember, Jacob didn't want to do what she said. He said, I might bring a curse on myself instead of a blessing. She said, your curse be upon me. This was her idea. He was just following along with what she did. Now, if you watch the story, you can see he's pretty clever improvising along the way, but the plan is hers, not his. The plan worked, and Jacob got the blessing. But this only bought some time because of Esau's plan to murder Jacob. So, she sent her favorite son away and likely never saw him again. And now that Jacob has the blessing, Jacob's the primary target of the fortune-hunting pagan women that are around. And where's the good women to be found? They're not there. All it is the women of the land. And Rebekah's so upset, she says, I loathe my life because of the daughters of Heth. If Jacob marries one of the women of the land, what good will my life be to me? Now, this seems to light a fire under Isaac. And Isaac then charges Jacob with, go to your mother's family and marry the daughters of Laban. Isaac's response indicates that he knew that she was right. You don't see any indication that Isaac is mad at Rebekah or even Jacob for what had happened. I think that's very much a light bulb moment that Isaac recognizes this is the way it's supposed to be. Because imagine if he had given the blessing to Esau, well, Rebekah had gotten the prophecy when they were born. How's that going to work out? To me, this is how God worked it out. We could say she should have not usurped authority, and she should have waited for God to solve the problem another way. But maybe this was the way. So my claim here, and you can disagree with me, is the great matriarch Rebekah saved the seed of Abraham and Isaac at tremendous personal risk and cost to herself. So she's not a mere conniver or deceiver. She's one of the great heroes of the Old Testament. But maybe I'm wrong. We'll find out in the kingdom. So that brings us back around to our understandable envy. What happened in this whole event, you can understand why Esau is really, really mad. It's been taken away from him, and it isn't fair. He's envious. He wants to kill his brother. He has no idea how much longer his father's going to live. But it's his own fault. He treated his birthright as nothing, and that's what the word despise means. We use the word despise kind of as a synonym for hate, but it really means to count as nothing. So when God says to David, "Why have you despised me?" It's not "Why have you hated me?" It's "Why have you counted me as nothing?" And a lot of people will say that the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. And indifference is worse than hate. A lot of times you can come back from hate to love someone, but it's hard to come back from indifference. So he treated his birthright as nothing, and he married Judith and Basemath. So what did he expect was going to happen? Next up, Jacob and Laban. Laban covets Jacob's wealth and success and treats him poorly. No matter what Laban tries to do, it always works out to benefit Jacob. Frustrating, and so his envy of Jacob is understandable. And then we move to Joseph and his brothers. Their anger at him and their envy of the position that he was chosen to get that special robe, which many have said indicate he's to be the next priest of the family. Completely understandable. They were older sons. But just like with Esau, it's their own fault. The way they treated their father and letting him believe Joseph was dead for 20 years, that completely confirms his judgment that Joseph should be the primary heir. And then Israel and Egypt. This is similar to Isaac and Abimelech. The Egyptians feared Israel's success. They were so successful in Egypt in a segregated area. They were off in Goshen because they were seen as detestable to the Egyptians. The Egyptians had a different solution, which was to enslave them rather than expel them. And that's happened before, too. It's another pattern that shows up in the history of Israel. But they saw greater advantage economically by keeping them there than by sending them away. Now, for the nation of Israel, envying them could have been a good thing. They were supposed to be a light to the Gentiles. If they had served God properly, he would have immeasurably blessed them, and others would have wanted the same. And they would have said, "Hey, we want what you got." And that's how the kingdom would spread to the whole earth. In theory, they didn't obey. Next example, we're going to accelerate some here to David and Saul. Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. And Saul became very angry for this displeased him. He said, "They have ascribed to David 10,000s, but to me only thousands. What more can he have with the kingdom?" And Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on. Saul was afraid of David. Fear and envy, same things. We're seeing that same pattern repeat itself. And even wanting a king in the first place, Israel was envying the nations around them. They wanted to be like them. Hitting the gas pedal even harder, the people of Israel had a nation and control of the land for a few hundred years, but then God allowed the Gentiles to take it away because of their wickedness. And the land was controlled by empires for 2,500 years, from about 597 BC till about 1948 AD. Now, this next slide was not influenced by Keith's class this morning. I had this there already. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. I completely agree with what he said about liking their real names better. Although, you got to admit, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego has a ring and a bounce to it that people like. But whenever I talk about them, I always mention their real names. Now, they were very successful in Babylon, far more successful than the Babylonian servants at Nebuchadnezzar. They were very envious of these men. Hence, we get a fiery furnace, and we get the lion's den, trying to kill off the Jews. Baby Jesus, born king of the Jews. Herod was so afraid he killed all the baby boys 2 years old and under. Other envy we see in the New Testament, the parable of the workers hired at different hours of the day. Perfectly understandable. If you worked all day and somebody who showed up for the last hour got paid as much as you, you'd probably be upset too. I'm sure I would. We wouldn't have liked that either. Prodigal son's another example. It sure is understandable that the older brother was upset when the other brother comes back and is treated so well. He gets a calf, and I never even got a goat. Envy. It's not fair. And we also see that this happened to Jesus. If we let him go on like this, all will believe in him, and the Romans will come, will take away our place and our nation. Fear. For Pilate knew that it was out of envy that they delivered him up. Fear and envy is what propelled them to get Jesus killed. AD 70, the Romans wiped out Jerusalem and the temple, and the Jews were scattered all over the world. And the Romans renamed the land Palestine. Since that time, there's always been a small number of Jews in the land, but the vast majority of Jews were elsewhere on the planet. There are countless examples in history of persecution and expulsion following that same pattern. Jews are smart, and they educate their children. In fact, Jews today, their average IQ is 110, which doesn't sound like much compared to our average 100 for everybody else, but that means you have tremendously more Jewish geniuses than you have in other groups. That's the way the bell curves work out. But in a lot of places, they were restricted from occupations, but they were all still able to become wealthy, often as money lenders. And you can see why people might come to hate them if they were money lenders and they had to pay them interest. And that's a repeating pattern throughout the last couple thousand years. Islam took over the land in the 600s, and it was mostly Muslim for well over 1,000 years. There were some periods of time during the Crusades where Christians took it back away from them. But by and large, it was in Muslim control, and even when it was in Christian control, it was still mostly Muslim. All right. We've kind of made it back to the line of scrimmage here. Planted in the land. Amos 9, 14, and 15. How did they get back there? Interesting thing I didn't know until recently is in 1799, Napoleon was very friendly towards Jews and the idea of a national home for them in Palestine. It didn't happen, but some of the ideas started to get rolling at that time. And this is going to be difficult to see the numbers, I'm sure. But this represents the population of the land from the birth of Christ up till very recently. So way early on, there's 2.5 million people in the land. Now, these are rough estimates. But over time, over the next 1,000 years, it dropped precipitously to like 150,000 in the late 1300s. And the 1500s is still in the 150,000 range when the Ottoman Empire took control of the land. So it was a series of empires. And the Ottoman Empire was the Turkish Empire, Muslim control of the land. But you can see over time, you start to see a little bit of blue right around the late 1800s. Actually, I think 1890s where I can first see a little blue. Then it builds tremendously after that. So they started moving there in the 1800s, but how did they get land? One thing to say, hey, let's move to Israel, but what are you going to do? They bought it. I have some quotes from an article that I looked up. If anyone's interested, I can send you the link to that. It's up there. In this article that he says, there's little doubt that the Arabs sold land to the Jews primarily because they needed the money. There was no big scheme for the Arabs to try to control the land at that time. It's just people had land there, and here's somebody willing to buy it, so sold. The Jewish land purchasers, however, had a specific plan, while the Arabs just sold because they needed money. In 1901, there was a Jewish National Fund set up to acquire land in Palestine for Jewish colonies. Next slide is going to be the population growth of Jews. So in the 1500s, there was roughly 5,000 Jews. 1882, about 24,000, and that's roughly around the time the migration to Israel started getting going. And by 1914, when World War I started, it's about 60,000, and it represents about 8% of the people. Then in 1917, there's an empire change. The Ottomans lost, one of the big losers of World War I, and the empire now in control of the land is the British Empire. But they weren't treating it as like part of their empire. They were trying to manage it. And over time, you can see the population grow, not just the numbers, but the percentages. And by 1947, 32% of the people in the land were Jewish. The Arabs were not happy about this. There was a lot of struggle going on. More understandable envy because they'd been there. You can understand why they'd be upset. Another reason they were so successful is, and I'm not going to read this, but just give you the idea. This is 1931. Jews were 18% of the people, but they were the majority of the literate people. And there were 2,000 Jews who could read Arabic, while there was only 20 other people who could read Hebrew. They had a big advantage. They had all the communication advantage. They had a plan. They were better educated, more knowledgeable about the Arabs than the Arabs were about them. So they could be very successful purchasing land in the region. This map shows the land in question at the end of World War II. The pink area there was given to create the nation of Jordan. The Jews had wanted the area in purple. They didn't get all of that. But the orange area there is the area that ended up being focused on. This is the 1947 partition plan that the UN came up with. The blue area is what they proposed to give to the Jews. The orange area is what they proposed to give to the Arabs. One thing the Arabs didn't like was that, well, it's just, the Jews are only a third of the people, but they get 2/3 of the land. But a lot of that land in the south is desert. So it isn't as unfair as that sounds. Ultimately, neither side was really happy about it, but the Jews chose to accept, and the Arabs chose war. They were offered a two-state solution, and they rejected it. And this has happened multiple times since that, till this day. One of the more recent ones was when Bill Clinton was president, and they rejected it. And since that time, the Jews have also gotten more land by winning the wars that the Arabs started. All right, October 7th, 2023. There was an understandable envy of the Jews' success. And on this date, their enemy started yet another war, started by, everyone knows it, Hamas. And one could say, it's Hamas, not the Palestinian people that supported those atrocities. There's some truth to that. And it's not fair that the Palestinians suffer. Now, when we think about that term, it's not fair, it's one thing to say, I'm going to accept things aren't fair for me, but I can't use that as an excuse to be bad to someone else. Just because, well, hey, life's not fair. Sorry, I'm mean to you, but it's not fair. No, we can't do that. But what did the Palestinians think about the October 7th attacks? 83% of the Palestinians in the West Bank support the October 7th attacks. Only 63.6% in the Gaza Strip. Interestingly, the people where it was have less support. But altogether, 75% of Palestinians support the October 7th attacks. That doesn't help the minority that doesn't like it. So, now I got this data from the Arab World Research and Development. Arab World for Research and Development, not from Israel. So this isn't an Israeli bias telling me these numbers. And male versus female, 93% of men, 72% of women support Islamic Jihad in general. And there's also, probably familiar with the Palestinian Authority. They're the less extreme Palestinian leadership in the Palestinian areas. And people's general opinion of the Palestinian Authority is negative. You can see those at the bottom. The vast majority of people don't look at the Palestinian Authority very positively, but the vast majority look at Hamas very positively. So Palestinians overwhelmingly support Hamas in the October 7th attacks. It comes from that same old understandable envy. Israel has the land, they want it. And some of it's not fair, that's true. But understandable envy is not justifiable envy. The people preaching from the river to the sea believe their envy is justifiable, so they justify these heinous acts. Okay, what about us? How should I feel about how Israel is conducting its war with Hamas? That's a hard question. As believers, we should be blessing Israel. That doesn't mean we put our stamp of approval on everything Israel does. Israel has frequently been in a similar situation to their great matriarch Rebekah. They have to protect themselves and their future from the people of the land. But they've done some questionable things to ensure their survival. I mean, as great as I think Rebekah was, certainly questionable. I'm not saying there's no case to be made the opposite direction. So what should we be doing? We should be asking God's blessing on Israel and praying for its enemies. We should be grieved by the great loss of life, both among Israel and among the Palestinians, and pray for peace. We don't have to like Israel's method of trying to get its hostages back. However, I'm going to say if we don't like how they're getting it back, I should supply them with a better plan rather than just criticize theirs. I don't have a better plan to offer them. But if you do, then send it on over. So how's all this going to play out? Here's our verses. I will restore the fortunes of my people Israel, and they shall rebuild the ruined cities and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and drink their wine, and they shall make gardens and eat their fruit. I will plant them on their land, and they shall never again be uprooted out of the land that I have given them, says the Lord your God. Most of this has already been fulfilled. It's that yellow part that we can't be certain about. Now, it's certain there's going to be a terrible attack coming someday, but I don't know if that's near or far. There are a lot of brothers who've studied it way more than I am, and if you're hoping to get any kind of timetable from me, I don't have one for you. But it doesn't matter when it's going to be. None of us knows how long we have. None of us knows when a house is going to fall on top of us. So we should be ready at all times for the return of Christ and for the kingdom. These prophecies are there to provoke our repentance and encourage us to endure to the end. So if you study prophecy and get that out of it, you've done well. Whether you understand what's going to happen next, who knows. One of my theories about the end times is, the first coming of Christ played out in a way nobody saw coming. I think the second coming of Christ is going to be like that too. I don't think any of us is going to see it coming. It's going to happen in a way we don't expect. But that's okay if it's made us repent and endure to the end. What will it be like in the kingdom? I don't know. Not specifically. Finding out whether I'm right or wrong about Rebekah and Job's wife? Yeah, that'll be nice. Prophecies about it, such as the wolf laying down with the lamb, those could be literal or they could be metaphorical. What do I know? I think the prophecies are largely given in terms we can understand. You know, if it had been given in our day, they might not talk about wolves and lambs. I don't know what would be talked about. But I do know no more sadness, no more envy, no more houses being dropped on our loved ones or us. And I know there are people in this room who've had houses dropped on your family. And I'm really bad at feelings, and I really appreciate my brother David being open about how he feels about things. So, no more houses dropped on people. God's will being done on earth as it is in heaven. And finally, eye has not seen, nor ear heard, nor have entered into the heart of man the things which God has prepared for those who love him. Ultimately, I don't know what the kingdom will be like. I just know it will be great.